All right, everybody, welcome back. Today we are talking to Brianne Brown from the University of Houston. I'll let her introduce herself and give her all of her intelligence and acronyms behind her name. But Brianne is somebody that got introduced to me from Brandon Howard, who you heard me talk to a couple weeks ago. But Brianne, thanks for coming on. Thanks for doing this. And if you want to give everybody a quick synopsis of you, we'll get this bad boy going.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for having me on. So my name is Brianne Brown. I'm the Director of Sports Performance for women's basketball and soccer at the University of Houston. So I've been here now. I'm going on my third season with basketball, my second year here. So been down here in the South for a little bit, but I was at Utah State beforehand.
That's got to be a little bit of a change for you. I mean, Southern Utah, if I'm not mistaken, for the undergrad?
Yeah, Southern Utah. I played soccer there for 4 years. And then I actually went and took an assistant coaching job out at Shattuck St. Mary's in Minnesota. And I was also the director of their women's soccer sports performance out there right out of college. So I was there for 2 years. Figuring out kind of what I wanted to do with my life and like what capacity I wanted to coach in. So I was still coaching soccer, but then I really took kind of like a role in the weight room for the first time out there, and a lot of good experiences there. Looking back on it, definitely an interesting transition from college to like a real job and being out in like a real coaching setting. Learned a lot of things that looking back on it, I probably won't want to do again. But no, it was a really great growing experience for sure. And then I got a call from Coach Bishop about a GA position opening up at Utah State. And over the 2 years that I was at Shattuck St. Mary's, I definitely realized that I found my calling a little bit more in the weight room rather than being a sport coach. And the collegiate setting was something that I definitely saw myself being in, just because I had such a great experience as a college athlete. So I jumped at the opportunity at Utah State, not really knowing what I was getting myself into. And then I went out to Utah State, and that's where I met Coach Howard and Coach Scholes and that whole gang. And really, like, it completely opened my eyes up to like training and just nutrition and everything under the sun, basically, in our profession.
Yeah, you walked into a literal gold mine. I don't think you necessarily understood I don't think anybody at the time realized what was going on at Utah State. At that time, I was still at Kansas State as their director of baseball, and saw some things from afar that they were doing. I had met one or two of their different coaches. I had never met Coach Bishop, still have not met Coach Bishop, but knew Coach Howard from my time in Louisiana. So that's, you literally, I mean, I think highly of them. You kind of hit the jackpot. I guess you spoke, you're young, you're working through the field. You spoke that you fell in love more with the strength and conditioning side than you did the sports side. Do you think that was something that when you were a player, you already leaned towards the sport performance side, or is it something you literally, when you got done, that was what you figured out?
As a student athlete, I definitely enjoyed being in the weight room. Being at Southern Utah, it's a very like mid-major, if that, Division I school, just in terms of like the resources that they have. Actually Coach Bishop was my strength coach in college when I was there. So I really enjoyed it. And I enjoyed aspects of sports performance in terms of like injury mitigation and things like that. I tore my ACL twice, so I'd been through like rehab and worked with athletic trainers and PTs and strength coaches. So I always had, it was kind of not obviously a really great situation, but I always had a really great support staff, I guess, when I was recovering from some of those injuries. And I knew I still wanted to be involved in athletics. I just wasn't sure exactly in what capacity I would be the most comfortable, or where I'd see myself kind of doing this for years and years. And then when I got the job at Shattuck St. Mary's and was actually able to, start programming, start teaching, start coaching on my own, I really just kind of realized I was like, this is what I love doing. I love like giving, I was working specifically with female athletes, a lot of confidence in the weight room. I was helping them more prepare for their sport rather than just like coaching their sport. So I think that's kind of where it was more so like a little bit in college, but also like once I was out of college and kind of doing my own thing, that I kind of realized that this was kind of what I really wanted to do. So, and then at Utah State, I was like, oh my gosh, like I have so much to learn.
Well, and it's beautiful that you say that, and to give you, because you and I have never actually met. I spent 10 years doing strength and conditioning.
Yeah.
And was in Louisiana, was at Kansas, and then did some private sector stuff. And it's awesome to hear that you say that you walked into a room and the first thing you realize is that you have so much to learn. And one thing that I try to tell all of any young coach that I come across that's younger than me, I'm early 30s, that's in their 20s, is you should always walk into a room and you should be blown away by the fact that, man, I have so much to learn. And you are in a good spot because you are with essentially Dr. Alan Bishop, it seems like these days. The guy's like a walking encyclopedia. But I'm curious, so did you play basketball in high school? Were you just a soccer?
Yeah, just soccer. I was terrible at basketball, so I stopped playing.
So that's awesome. That's why I asked. So when I got thrown into strength and conditioning, when I started strength and conditioning, I went out to Louisiana to Northwestern State.
Mm-hmm.
I had played football all my life. I stopped playing a lot of sports when I was like a sophomore in high school. And they said, okay, you're going to assist with football, but now you're going to be the director of baseball. And I was like, okay, well, I don't really know all that much about the game's ins and outs. And I sure don't know that much about the demands, but I can kind of think of my way through it. When they said, hey, you're going to start working with basketball, like, how did you break that down? How did you approach that moving forward?
So luckily at Utah State, Brandon kind of talked about it a little bit, but especially because I was a GA out there, I was on the floor with every single sport, whether that was, golf or tennis, women's soccer, basketball. I was on the floor for football. So I was given a lot of opportunity and was able to work with basically every sport that we were there. So, on the floor at 5:30 in the morning and not getting off until, 6:00 at night. So, luckily when I took the job down here at Houston, it wasn't the first time that I had been around basketball. I assisted pretty heavily with women's basketball my first year as a GA and traveled with them a little bit as well. So I kind of dipped my toes a little bit with that. So luckily, like I said, I kind of knew what was going on, kind of idea of what the schedule was like. But, I think when it comes down to it, when you're talking about training athletes in particular, the basics are the basics and they can be applied throughout, the majority of sports. There's going to be certain nuances that might be, in particular, something that you need to look at basketball compared to maybe, golf or a baseball or softball. But, everyone still needs to be looking at certain performance indicators. And I think if you just stick to just a philosophy that you have, which I learned from, Coach Scholes and Coach Howard at Utah State, I think it can be applied to obviously like a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different athletes, making them the most robust athletes that you can. There's a lot of success that you find just doing a lot of the basic things really, really well.
Absolutely. And so you're down to Houston, you have soccer, you have basketball, which largely they both require lower body wise, a very similar demand, lots of change of directions, lots of start and stop. But you've got basketball that has a little bit more plyometric to it, not a little bit more, has a whole lot more plyometric to it, unless you're, a striker, you're somebody that plays air style game in soccer.
Right.
Do you differentiate in that? Is there a large difference? Are you counting jumps? How are you approaching that difference between the two?
I think if you just kind of look at the fiber type dominance too of basketball compared to soccer, you're looking at a lot more like fast twitch. So, I'm able to do a lot more Olympic variations, I'd say, with my basketball girls, just because, one, they need it. Two, they can do it a lot easier. Plyometric training is interesting with basketball, just because they spend basically like 10 months out of the year like playing. So they're constantly jumping and pounding and all that stuff. So I don't have this like big plyometric training regimen that I do with my female basketball players. Playing and practicing takes a lot of the plyometric training away from me just because they get it naturally. But a lot of it that we focus on here at Houston is just landing mechanics, and, energy absorption and how to redirect it. So that's kind of what I typically look at in terms of basketball plyometric training. I'm not super, I don't want to say creative. I don't get like super, super creative. It's really, really basic stuff that we just really try to hammer home really, really well. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that answers, you're spot on. Believe me that there's no, not sure there's a right or wrong answer to that situation, or to really any situation in strength and conditioning beyond basics. Are you fooling around? Are you messing with any rate of force development, like some overspeed stuff on jumps, triphasic? I know that I assume because y'all are working side by side, I know Alan is doing a little bit of tempo work, obviously the foundation of, full range of motion, but are y'all doing any overspeed or over assisted jumps just to work on some of that rate of force development?
Not yet. Last summer was my first summer with the basketball team, and they hadn't actually gone through like a full summer training of 8 weeks. So there are a lot of things when I was looking at my priority list where things needed to be, and there was just a couple more things that I felt were a little bit more important to take care of right off the bat. I had some plans for this summer to try some of that. But obviously with where we're at right now, there will be other aspects of training that I'll have to address first. So no, I haven't done a ton of that yet with my basketball team, just because there was a couple other things that I felt were a little bit more important to introduce in terms of a team training atmosphere. Like you said, I train very similar to, Coach Souls and Coach Howard down at Tech, and obviously Coach Bishop, where everything's on. We use tempo on everything, almost everything. And so that's a really big part of training, and trying to make sure that that's being understood and done at a really high level takes a lot of time and effort. So, my first whole year was basically getting the girls to understand how they needed to train, how I wanted them to train, how to understand how we were training and why we were doing it. And that was a really, really big, important factor in like what I wanted to incorporate and bring to the program that was at Houston when I first got here. So I haven't been able to do a lot of, the fun, maybe get a little zesty just yet. We were kind of getting into it, and obviously everything happened. So we'll see. I'm hoping we can get to some zesty stuff, but.
No, but you're spot on. You're, as much as a sport coach builds their culture and builds their program and builds their foundation, you do the same thing. And there's things, believe me, I get it. And you're doing a great job of not trying to call anyone there. You got there and you're like, hey, we need to start, at the foundation here. We need to lay a better base and lay a better foundation, which is awesome. Which then I want to know, just because I was a young coach and I took over young teams and teams that when I walked in, I was like, oh buddy, we've got to do some things here. When you were explaining it to your athletes, when you were explaining it to your girls, and for instance, and everybody is probably that's listening to this has seen it, is the squatting, hips below knees, pristine, making sure that we get full hip flexion, knee flexion. And we're doing so on some sort of an incline or whatever you want to call it, a heels elevated. Mm-hmm. When you're trying to explain that to an 18 to 21-year-old, 22-year-old, what was your process? How were you explaining that?
Sometimes I don't think we give athletes enough credit. They're really, really smart. And when you just break it down and just give it to them straight, they're actually pretty receptive to what you actually are saying. So I was just pretty straightforward. I was like, you know what, guys, like, or girls, strength is very joint specific. So if we're only training this range and this range, we might be missing 70% of what we could actually be getting. We might not be putting as much weight on as we normally would, but now we're actually protecting and making sure that we're training through full ranges of motion. And it's easy to kind of look, our head coach at Houston is like very run and gun, high tempo, likes to press, get on the floor, get the ball type deal. So it was really easy for me just because I was watching practice and it was like, there's a loose ball, it's like battle galore. So it was like, hey, look, like Jazz, when you like are diving on the floor for a ball and someone like rolls up your ankle and falls on top of your knee, like wouldn't you rather make sure that you've been in that position in, a very controlled environment with, maybe some weight on your back where you've actually been able to, protect yourself. And a lot of them were like, oh yeah, that like kind of makes sense. And, just as like training goes, it's a slow cook. So it just takes a lot of time just for them to start seeing results as well. And for them to like really understand what you're saying. So I was just pretty straightforward, and obviously I was coaching really, really hard, and was just trying to make sure that like the standard was kind of set. And once that was kind of established, it was pretty easy. Obviously some girls will ask questions, some won't. But I think they kind of understood that whenever I had them do something, I was always able to give them a reason why, or an explanation as to why we were doing it a certain way. And so that just made it a lot easier for them to kind of buy in and understand like, okay, this is where we're going in the weight room. These are the expectations. And hey, I actually feel like a lot better playing. Like I actually feel a lot stronger. We're actually moving a little bit more weight now. Oh my gosh, I can actually see my like quads. So,
so you approached it from the injury mitigation side of, hey, and I got my FRC in 2015, so I'm right there with you. And if you want to drink the Kool-Aid, if you want to call it that, like I'm a firm believer in it. Was a firm believer in it back then, firm believer in it now. And you hit the nail on the head. If you've never been in it, if you've never trained in it, how can you defend when you're in it? Right. And love the fact that you're using we dive on the floor and somebody rolls you up, or your knee gets caught in a bad situation. If you're not familiar with that situation, then how can you give yourself a chance to fight for injury? Also love the fact that you're saying we don't give athletes enough credit in today's climate. It seems like we're sometimes really hard on athletes, and we say that they've changed or that they've gotten softer, if you will. And in general, I don't think any of that's changed. I think every coach that I've asked that would say that it's that we actually demand more and more, and our athletes are smarter than they've probably ever been. They were smarter than I was when I played, 15 years ago.
Right.
Something that I'm always curious about, not so much from the training or the knowledge side. You were young. You came straight out of college. You went and coached at the school up north. Forgive me, I cannot. St. Mary's.
Shattuck St. Mary's, yeah.
Shattuck St. Mary's. Thank you, Shattuck St. Mary's. You came back to Utah State, and then now you're at Houston. And so you're still young. You're growing in your career. Yeah. I remember being terrified walking into a room at like 23 years old, knowing that the kids that I was coaching were only 21, 22, like a year under me, and that I was supposed to guide them. I was supposed to have this leadership role. Did that ever cross your mind? Did you do something about it? How did that feel?
I will forever be in debt, I feel like, to Coach Souls from when I was at Utah State, just because I just feel like I learned from him, and obviously everyone that's worked with him understands it too. It's like when you're coaching, like it doesn't matter. Like if you control the room, like as long as you're coaching really, really well and really, really hard, and just like working your butt off, that's what's going to earn, or hopefully earn, the respect of some of the athletes. I just feel like from being on the floor so much and working with like football and other like men's sports, it doesn't matter how old you are, if you're a girl or a guy. If you're being genuine and you're truly trying to make the athlete better, I feel like they understand that and they respect that, as it comes. Obviously, with me walking in, I got hired in October. So literally we were about to start season. The first weekend that I was in Houston, we went and did a closed scrimmage against Mississippi State. So I hadn't even been in Houston for a week before we started traveling. So it was obviously the least optimal time to be hired ever. But I guess that's the story for everything. But so I didn't really have, like, when I got here, my role wasn't like, hey, let's go in the weight room. It was, all right, hey, here we go. It's basketball season. So it definitely did take a little bit longer than I probably personally would have wanted to get things like rolling with me. So in my situation in particular, it gave me a little bit of time to get to know some of the girls, outside of the weight room before we were spending a bunch of time in it. So, obviously they look at me and they're like, you look as old as us. How are you going to coach us? But obviously, like,
no doubt.
But once we're in those situations, it's like, I don't know. I wasn't ever worried about coaching in the weight room. And I learned a lot of that from Coach Howard and Coach Scholes and, Joey and Coach Bishop at Utah State. It's just like, it doesn't matter when you're on the floor coaching if I'm 26 or 23 or, 35. I mean, if you control and demand things out of the athletes, like, they'll respond. If you're worried about what they're thinking or whatnot, like, I'm more worried about the lift than I am what they're thinking of my age. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it answers it. And it's really good because it brings up the topic and it brings up the point that it's about doing the job. And if you are prepared and knowledgeable, the players are going to follow you regardless of age, because leadership knows no age, in my opinion. Right. Leadership is about preparedness. So again, I know I'm bringing up being younger, but because it's valuable to a lot of younger coaches out there that are listening to this, how, as a younger coach, did you make sure that you were prepared to point? Obviously, you had phenomenal mentors. You had,
right.
We already talked about that, but specifically what did you do to make sure that you were on point, you were ready to go, that as soon as you were done with the graduate assistantship, you got to go to the University of Houston, be a director of a women's basketball program? That's a highly prestigious position to be in. How did you prove yourself and prepare yourself at that age?
I mean, obviously, like you said, I kind of walked into like a gold mine of mentors. So they obviously helped prepare me. I know Brandon brought up Richard Borden, but I don't think anything can be more valuable than your own personal training. I cleaned in college, but I never, full Olympic lifted. And I did that at Utah State for the first time. And I was decent at it. Nowhere near like putting up numbers to be able to be competitive. But I took a lot of value in learning how to train, and not just train athletes, but myself. So I feel like that definitely helped develop me as a coach, being able to look and see certain cues and be able to know how to correct those like immediately. Obviously being on the floor as much as humanly possible. I think that prepared me like more than I could ever say, just because, I feel like developing your coaching voice is one of the hardest things to do when you're a younger coach. But once you find it, and once you realize like that being yourself and using your coaching voice is the best thing that you can do, then I feel like that takes away a lot of insecurities or, I guess, worries about being able to coach a room. If I can get, 15 of the O-line on football to do wave squats on my call and my tempo, and they are doing it, you know what I mean? It's just, once you get into situations and you're put in those situations over and over and over again, you stop being worried because you get so excited to coach. I'm trying to think of like how else. I definitely think like what you said, like being prepared. And I think like just my experience at Utah State in particular, like really prepared me for a job like this, in a position, I guess, to be in in the position that I am. And then obviously, being with Coach Bishop, he's been doing men's basketball only for a couple years now. And, seeing how how he runs a room, and then how he, addresses his athletes and addresses certain situations that might be specific to basketball, I think has obviously really helped me too, being able to see like a really high level coach work at a high level as well on like just the basketball side. So yeah, I mean, I think that
you use the wealth around you. You use your eyes, you use your ears. You're constantly trying to just absorb. It's what we talked about at the very beginning, where you should always be learning. And one thing that I tried to always convey to even people that didn't coach, when they said, well, you've only been doing this for 2 or 3 years. I said, yes, but what you have to kind of wrap and think about is that I may have only been doing it for 2 to 3 years, but every day I'm training 4 to 5 sports. You're writing 2 to 3 different types of programs. And so where it only looks like 2 to 3 years on paper, you may have been training 3, 6, 7 years worth of programs, because you're doing it all simultaneously, walking through situations and walking through annual plans. It's why kind of strength and conditioning starting out is so different than anything else. Sport coaching, You're coaching your sport.
Right.
You start out as strength and conditioning, it's everything.
Right.
Like you talked about.
And it's hundreds of athletes every day, right? I mean, if I just looked at like a normal Monday at Utah State, I was in the building at 4:45 and we had softball at 5:30 and it didn't stop until about 10:30. And then it would go from like 1 to 6. So it's like you're on the floor for multiple athletes, multiple hours, working different sports, different personalities, different needs. And then, you go out to practices and you're watching them compete and be in their sport and in their element. So, you see a lot of things. And I feel like especially as a GA, like if you're not just absorbing everything like a sponge, then I feel like you're kind of wasting your time a little bit, just because like that should be the time that you're just like taking everything in and being on the floor as much as humanly possible, working with as many teams as you can, because then you might be thrown into a situation like mine where, originally my job was only for women's basketball, but, obviously I have a soccer background and worked with soccer at Utah State, that, I was easily able to add on to another sport, and, still give my expertise and help them, be competitive as well. So it just opens more opportunities for you, I guess, the more prepared you are in terms of just like working with as many athletes and teams as you can.
Yeah, because as you grow in the business, as you grow in strength and conditioning, you just become more and more narrow focused. When you start out working with everything, and then you have already started that path of now I'm women's soccer and basketball, you may get into another position later in a few years where it's only basketball. Now you're working with 15 to 20 girls.
Right.
And that's your interaction. That's your only program. So those first 3 years, we'll call it, that's just a generic number, but those first 3 years are vital, because you're getting to get exposure to so much going on around you.
Yeah.
When you were at Utah State and you got to work with, and the reason I asked this, so you got to work with football.
Yes.
Okay. And so when I was at Northwestern State, one of my dear friends was the director of women's basketball at UTSA for 3 years. And then she just got out of just the field in general, but she was there. She worked with me at Northwestern State. She worked football. And I still to this day say that she was one of the best coaches to ever work around me with football, for the things that you have already discussed. Did you approach it any different, or were you able to literally follow that same, once I'm on the floor, I'm coaching and here we go?
Football was, I will first off say, like, football was so fun to be around and to coach. Like if any coach, I'm not just saying females, have the opportunity to work football, do it, because it 100% made me a better coach. But I was lucky just because Coach Scholes is such like a great director that basically when I walked in at Utah State, he had obviously been there for a couple years and established such an amazing culture that if you were on the floor with football, everyone knew that you deserved to be there. So it wasn't one of those things where it's like, why is a girl on the floor? Like, it was, okay, Coach Scholes let her be on the floor, then she's ready to go. Like, she's ready to go. We're listening to her. Like, she is an extension of him and his staff. So it wasn't, I lucked out, I feel like, just because he had such a great culture that once I was on the floor, it was like I was just like every other coach on the floor as well. So it wasn't ever like, oh, you know, Coach Bree's telling us this. Like, is it really true? It's like, no, Bree's saying it's 5 to 7 reps at a 3:0:10 tempo, go type deal. So, like I said, I lucked out just because I was surrounded by a really, really great culture. And I definitely think that made my experience really, really positive. And, you know, when you're in a room full of like 50 guys, like squatting really heavy, it's just a different atmosphere for sure. I don't think it can be replicated like anywhere in any other sport. But yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like the culture that was already set ahead of like the time that I was there made it a super positive experience for me. Just being able to hop on the floor and just go. It wasn't really like I had to, you know, get a ton of like, I wasn't getting talked back to or anything like that. The guys were super respectful, and they actually like thought it was kind of cool that a girl was on the floor coaching with them. So
it's no doubt. And that was so having the confidence from up above and having the backing from your director is vital. And it's really cool to hear that Coach Scholes is that way. And you're 100% right. If you got a great director and they have already portrayed to the team, like, hey, if this person's on the floor, you're listening, there's a reason they're on the floor.
Yeah.
And I do agree with you. As much as people want to say that it may not be that much different having a room of 50 guys or 40 guys and the music's loud and everybody's hooping and hollering and yelling and it's loud and it's just different.
Yeah.
And for me, even being a male in the field, it slowed everything down for me because it always seemed like football lifts moved faster because there was just more moving parts. There was more distractions going on. And then when you got into a lift that had less people in it and sometimes less weight, the room slowed down and was able for you to really kind of grasp and see what was going on.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's a really great way to put it now that you just said that.
I agree with you. If any female, if any male, it doesn't matter. If you're a young coach, if you can just get in a room with football and be a part of it, you'll see a really finely tuned moving machine, and you'll understand what a super fast, high intense room can be. And then when you take that same intensity, because that's the goal, to take that same intensity from that you just saw and instill it in the rest of your athletes, it makes your life a lot easier as a strength coach. And it makes you a lot more successful.
Yeah. I mean, obviously helping out with football was really eye-opening. And so when I took the job down here at Houston, I only had 15 girls. Actually, I think we only had 14 my first season. I was like, man, this is the life. Like 14 athletes, like this is easy to like get on the floor and coach and like really watch them move, and just organizing a room. Like you don't realize like how much really goes into that on the football end. So when you start transferring that over a little bit more to some of the smaller Olympic teams, obviously, you know, baseball has a really big roster, softball has a really big roster. But even working with some of those rosters, it's a lot easier to start managing certain things just because you're like, well, we just had like 3 lift groups with like, you know, 40 guys in it or whatever, 30, 35. And it's like, okay, well, you know, we can organize this in a way that it can be the most efficient. We're getting everything out of it that we need. So I definitely think that helped in terms of like organization, learning that from, you know, Coach Scholes and how he did that with football and kind of applying it to the Olympic side as well.
Organization is huge. And that was one thing that beyond preparedness that I try to tell people, anybody that I talk to, is that if you're organized, if you're prepared, and when I say you're organized, your program is organized. Your program may not be the best program that's ever been seen. Like there may be holes in your program. There may be weaknesses in your program because you're just not there yet or you haven't learned it. But if the dang thing is organized, and if you're organized and you present yourself in that way, coaches are going to follow you. Kids are going to follow you. You're going to have much more confidence. But if you're unorganized, if you don't keep things tidy and neat, and you don't have a reason for what you're doing, you're really going to struggle. starting out, and you're not going to be able to put yourself in a position. Clearly you are organized. Clearly you've put yourself in that position, or you would not be where you're at right now. Transitioning a little bit from the programming professional side, just because I'm curious, I asked Brandon the same kind of things. Southern Utah, St. Mary's, back to Utah, now down to Houston, Texas. Was that something you just said, yep, I'm willing to do it? I'm like, when you started out, you were like, yep, I'm willing to go anywhere and everywhere? Or is this kind of one of those things that along the way you've just kind of been like, yeah, okay, I'll do this?
I actually grew up a military brat. My dad was in the Army. He went to West Point. So I actually didn't live in the States until my senior year of high school. So I was born in Hawaii. We had moved almost every 2 years, basically, since I was born. So moving is actually like very normal to me. That it would be very not normal for me if I was somewhere for like 5 years. So when I was kind of at Utah State and I found out that, hey, like you might actually have to move a lot, I was like, cool. Like that sounds like pretty on my level of what I'm used to. So my husband's a little bit different, but he grew up and was born and raised in Minnesota. This is like the first time he's left the state. So
oh man.
So that was different for him. But for me, like, if it's the right opportunity, I don't have a problem with, going somewhere. That never really like worried me or scared me. That was just kind of like normal life for me. So moving, back out to Utah and then down here to Texas, I've never been like anywhere south of New Mexico, or I don't even know, like Oklahoma. I've never been down into the South. So
you went about as far south as you could get.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was a little nerve wracking because I've never been here, but moving and, changing scenery and locations wasn't ever like a worry for me. So.
Well, I mean, I got to ask, so you military brat, you're bouncing. My parents were military brats. I was not, but you bounce around base to base, born in Hawaii. I assume you lived in some different international countries and different continents. Do you believe that has given you a leg up on people around you in the profession just because you've seen so many cultures? Has that helped you? Has it hurt you? Has it done nothing at all?
No, I mean, I'd always like to say that, I grew up a lot in like Germany and Uzbekistan and Ukraine. So I've been, Southeast Asia, I've been, Central Asia, I've been in Europe. So, you see a lot of different things. You see a lot of different, ways of life, and you see a lot of different things that a lot of different people come from. I definitely feel like it's made me more adaptable. And, even if you're looking at the US, people's backgrounds and where they come from, it's very different. So I think that's just made me a little bit more aware of that, if you can say that. Everyone comes from, different home lives, different backgrounds. So I feel like you need to make sure that you're just aware of the situations and what could be happening. And I think that's made it easier for me to like connect with different athletes, just because, I haven't grown up in, not that it's wrong, but I haven't grown up in like one place my whole life. I've been a lot of different places and, visited a lot of different places too. And so, when we had one of the kickers at Utah State was from Germany. And I grew up pretty close to where he was from. And so like we would speak German to each other sometimes. And we talked about soccer. Not a lot of football guys will talk soccer with you. So, it's just like different ways to make small connections with athletes on like a non-sport level, for sure.
Yeah, having that wider scope. If your scope is narrow, some people think that's very effective because you're just focused on one thing. But if your scope's very wide, it can only help you in connections. I think it's awesome that you were speaking German and talking about soccer and with your kicker, because those things are invaluable. And I love that you brought up the fact of not living in one place and understanding that people's situations are completely different. Because quite honestly, until I moved away, I mean, I lived in the same place and I was 18, and then I moved after that. I moved 8 years. And that was super effective for me because it opened up my eyes to, man, there's so many different cultures. There's so much more different. And I didn't even move out of the States. I just moved different places in the country. It's extremely effective. Man, I don't have any other questions. I think I have questions as far as international. I mean, we could spend another hour talking about just time international and specifically soccer. I am a huge soccer fan, but I think for this little meeting, we're good. I want to shut this one down. Because I'd like to do this again at some point and talk to you more about the international side and the soccer side and growing up, because I think you got a lot of good things. I ask everybody when they're kind of signing off, if you got a 1 to 2 minute little spiel that you would give specifically to younger coaches that are up and coming, what would you tell them to help them get them running?
That one's kind of an easy one for me. And sorry, I feel like I reference him a lot, but Coach Scholes was such a big proponent of continuing ed. And like he'd always say, like, if you're not willing to invest in yourself, why should anybody else invest in you? So, I've taken that to heart a lot. So, if you're a young coach, I think, there's obviously invaluable experience being on the floor, but if there's anything that you can do continuing ed-wise, taking certifications, reading about nutrition, finding like a little niche that you can become a little bit more of an expert on to add to what you bring to the table, I think that's really stuck with me and definitely helped me out, as I'm growing as, a young coach. So I would definitely say like invest in yourself, and continuing ed would be like a huge thing for me for advice. So
I would 100% agree with you. And I think Brandon said something very close. And I love that if you don't invest in yourself, who's really going to invest in you? And it's a phenomenal line to remember. So Brianne, I really appreciate the time. I really appreciate the insight. This was new for me. Like I told you, you're the first one this was the first meeting between you and I, and it was as good as Brandon said it was going to be. So good luck moving forward. We're going to do this again. I'm not going any way, but thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This was fun.